Awesome. So I am going to start. My name is Sandra Mull, and I am one of the co-chairs, I don't know what we call ourselves, of the Mcmaster Co-Design Hub. So I'm just going to give a bit of an overview because some of you may not be familiar with the hub. So I'll give a little bit, 2 minutes, and I'm going to actually start though with a land acknowledgement. One of the things that we really want to do is recognize the importance of our Indigenous partners. And the land acknowledgement that I'm going to do is actually from Mcmaster, but recognizing that many of you are not from our area. So again, feel free, or you put your location in the land acknowledgements, feel free to, or in the chat of where you're from, if you know where you're from in terms of the Indigenous communities, welcome to do that as well. So we'd like to just start by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations as the traditional inhabitants of the lands where Mcmaster stands. And to say that is really to acknowledge a debt to those who were before us and to recognize a responsibility as guests to respect and honor the intimate relationship Indigenous peoples have to this land. And a little bit about the hub. Oops, I guess I can put it on. Here we go. The Mcmaster Co-Design Hub, we're a 3-year project funded through the Mcmaster Strategic Alignment Initiative. And really our passion is about co-creating health and social service system change with equity deserving populations. And this is actually a little bit of we did some visioning exercises together about what it is that we're doing. And you'll see that this visual here has people at the center of the work that we're doing and thinking about how do we engage people around this kind of co-design work, educate, innovate, and evaluate. So that's a little bit of the raison d'etre, I guess, for our group. And the speaker series is one of the initiatives that we have to start to bring in guests who are doing really innovative work in the co-design space. And this is our Co-Design Hub core team. We're an interdisciplinary group of researchers, trainees, service providers, and lived experience experts, and many of them are on the call today. And we'd be happy to chat. Oops, I think I'll pop it in the chat. We do have a website, a newsletter. Again, I'm happy for you to join our mailing list about events that we're doing. And I'll turn it over to Michelle. So that's a little bit about us. And Michelle, who is one of our members of our Co-Design Hub team, is going to start us off and introduce our speaker today.
Well, thank you, Sandra. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm a member of the Hub, very fortunate to be a member of the Mcmaster Hub, but also the GPD for Inclusive Design and Design for Health at OCAD University. And it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Jutta Treviranus. Jutta is the director of the Inclusive Design Research Center, so the IDRC, and she's a professor in the Faculty of Design at OCAD University in Toronto. Jutta established the IDRC in 1993 as the nexus of a growing global community that proactively works to ensure that our digitally transformed and globally connected society is designed inclusively. Dr. Treviranus also launched an innovative graduate program in inclusive design at OCAD University, which we're all very happy to be a part of. Jutta is credited with developing an inclusive design methodology that has been adopted by large enterprise companies, as well as public sector organizations internationally. She has helped to develop numerous policies, standards, and resources to protect rights and support inclusion. One of her research topics is the impact of the treatment of diverse outliers and small minorities in data analytics. So I'll pass you over to Jutta now. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And I'm going to now share my slides. And we tried this earlier, so hopefully it will work. And do you have the right view? Perfect. Okay, thank you. And thank you so much. I'm very honored to be able to speak in this series. And I've called my presentation Inclusive Design for Our Collective Health and Wellbeing. And in terms of acknowledgement, I'm in Toronto with which is the ancestral and traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat. I told Sandra and Emma that I just came back on the train yesterday. And while I was on the train, I actually completely rewrote what I was going to tell you, because I was reminded that I was at McMaster in the early 80s. And so in a sense, I'm returning to McMaster. And McMaster felt like a home for my odd and difficult ideas. In fact, one of the first homes for my odd and difficult ideas. And speaking here, I was thinking that it's a safe place to tell my story. I've constantly been fighting the prevailing perspectives, and here I can share rather than argue, and share sort of some of my uncertainties. And I also feel, given that it's about co-design, that one of the commitments certainly we have in co-design is to reciprocal bravery, or how can we ask our co-designers to share their stories when we're not prepared to share ours? So be prepared for my story. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to tell it. I often say of late that my greatest qualifications are over 40 years of making mistakes and having failures. And there are, however, within all of these mistakes and failures, these recurring questions, uncertainties, and struggles that are woven throughout my career or my life. And I'll tell you about some of those. Before McMaster, I started out wanting to study medicine and actually was accepted and earned a scholarship to study. But during the orientation to medical school, I was really distressed at the reduction of the person to the disease, the refusal to take the whole person into account. And I actually got into quite a battle with the person that was doing the orientation. So in a bit of a huff, I chose to move to occupational therapy, which promised to be more holistic and more respecting of the agency of the person. And this was actually my first encounter with troubling hierarchies. Everyone felt that I had thrown away a promising career for a lesser profession, that I was turning away the opportunity for profit, prestige, and security. And people seemed to actually be insulted by my choice, like I had betrayed their support, which started a whole bunch of questions for me. And I was in for some disappointment and disillusionment as well in OT school, because I discovered that in the then 70s view of academic achievement, occupational therapy school consisted largely of memorizing predetermined listicles of best practices. And they weren't very condoning of my asking, why these? And what about this? What have you left out here? And what about in this situation? And in fact, one of my first acts of rebellion was to help to initiate a review of the program, which isn't a very good thing to do when you're still a student within the program. And then my next lesson came when I tried to submit a final paper or fourth year paper, or actually it was called a fourth year thesis at the time, on experiences and potential role of OT in rape crisis centers, because at the time I was volunteering in some rape crisis centers. I had to go before a committee to defend this, and I was threatened with not actually graduating and not being certified as an occupational therapist. I was told it was not in scope and not relevant to OT. I did finally graduate though, but certainly had to modify my thesis. The next major lesson was in my foray into publishing with a group of pediatric clinicians working with children who were non-speaking. And I did this after a visit to Guatemala and other Central American countries during the earthquake. And I worked there and I met a number of clinicians who noticed that there was an unusual pattern of dysarthria that seemed to occur when their mothers were victims of imprisonment and torture during pregnancy. And the paper that we published talked about the complexity of the issues they faced and the need to treat not only the dysarthria, but the family trauma. And this was at the time when there was a denial that there was anything like this occurring in Central America or any of the US supported regimes. And so every journal said, we cannot publish this. It isn't supported. It's it's out of scope. And so I started to think about, well, a number of questions from these early experiences. What are the boundaries we draw? And who gets left out? What are the hierarchies we create and the values that, in fact, they then promote? And the truths that we construct and what we deny or refuse to see. McMaster was also the place where I began to learn about things like the danger of technical triumphalism and technical determinism, the double-edged sword of technology, the disproportionate experience of both the opportunities and the risks, and the very complex adaptive system that we live in that we can't ignore. And also something that I call the Cobra Effect, or that is called the Cobra Effect. One of my first contracts while working in Hamilton was to pilot inclusive education in post-secondary university. There was the emergence of something called Bill 82, the integration bill. It had just been passed, and McMaster, being very forward thinking, wanted to see what would be required to integrate students with a range of disabilities in post-secondary education. It was also the emergence of the personal computer. I saw it as the perfect translation device, translating any voluntary action into controlling actions and translating any output into a different sense. Text to speech, speech to text, gesture input, indirect input, alternative pointing, anything could be translated so that someone could control writing, speaking, and art, and any number of things that were possible now through this strange translation device. And it was a wonderful skunk works. We just simply and practically took the thing apart and changed it and customized it the way that we needed. And we built some technologies that actually have never again been repeated, and created a device that was far more interesting, I think, than and certainly far more inclusive than some of the things that we have right now. So I was convinced that we could produce a system that didn't require one size fits all compromises, as was required in architecture and industrial design, but a system that could support one size fits one experiences. But I soon realized that profit was going to win over the common good. The systems became locked up. They became proprietary. Our fringe needs were not important and would not be included, could only be provided as a separate, segregated assistive technology industry. And Sandra, you're looking troubled. Is my audio okay or anything? No, okay, good. Through this, I first got an inkling that digital systems couldn't be retrofit. They must be proactively designed to be inclusive. So not only did we need to think about one size fits one rather than one size fits all, but we needed to not retrofit like we could within architecture. And it was my first introduction to the Cobra Effect, the falling into the rut of monocausality when the causes are complex and entangled. And not considering the unintended consequences of oversimplistic solutions to complex problems, linear thinking, not considering that we needed to think about all of the nested issues that accompanied the things that we were designing. And how this came about is we never considered the assistive technologies existed in a market ecosystem that required unachievable interoperability. So the assistive technology market that we created by virtue of being segregated meant that we had a niche industry that only had a certain amount of support that needed to then work with a much larger technical market that it couldn't keep up with and couldn't never catch up with. So this wonderful assistive technology industry that we created resulted in products that were more expensive, less usable, and that increased in cost, and therefore we're never going to actually provide the features that everyone else was able to use. These lessons were repeated again and again in many of my experiences. I became involved in the early emergence of the World Wide Web. I was involved in something called SGML, the use of a language that would allow publishers to publish once and then to produce or present what they had published in many different forms. And I thought, wow, this is a way that we could, again, recognize human difference and support human difference. And this was a type of technology that was then expanded by Tim Berners-Lee in the World Wide Web. And the early visions of the web was that this would be a common platform where anybody and everybody could express their diversity and connect across that diversity and find a deeper commonality to share, to find friendships. And because the people that I was working with tended to be small minorities and outliers in their communities, here is a way to reach across the world and find other people who shared similar issues and similar problems. But of course, here again, short-term profit won out over the common good. Popularity, likes, and all of those issues of what can be monetized, how can we support the influence of the most popular, the popularity echo chambers, etc., won out. Even though I knew from experience that this, that thinking in the way that the web became the thought that that we could ignore the outliers and the small minorities would actually be more costly, because I knew that if you plan only for the center and you ignore the outliers and the small minorities, that your systems would require more help, require more support, would continuously have to be patched, and would reach end of life much more quickly. But that if we plan together with those individuals who are outliers and small minorities, the whole range of human diversity, that we create a much more dynamically resilient system that doesn't require as much repair and patching on, and therefore is much more adaptable and could exist and become much, have a much greater longevity. And of course, the other disappointment and disillusionment that came with the web was the distortion of sharing, friendship, human connection, the tarnishing and hijacking of the values that I held dear. The other experience that happened with the web is the emergence and the early opportunities that we saw in web accessibility. And in fact, something that turned out to be so optimistic and so promising only deepened my sense of the opportunities and the risks of these new disruptive technologies. Because what happened with the Web Accessibility Initiative is there was the development of this sense that we could reach full accessibility. And I knew that that was something that, in fact, denied the diversity and the complexity of the situation we were addressing. To compel a more accessible web, we resorted to putting our guidelines and advice into regulations and laws. These required simple, measurable, static standards. And these were the antithesis to diversity and complexity. Who is left out? How do we keep up to date with changing technology? How do we deal with the misalignment of progress? And again, I encountered the unfairness and the damage done by protected boundaries and groupings. Because from many different experiences there, I learned that, in fact, looking for full web accessibility and certifying organizations and companies as being fully accessible, we were making it even harder for the individuals that were not included within those protected groups to find the justice that they needed, to find the accessibility that they needed. Companies and organizations felt that they had spent a lot of money, they had been certified as accessible. So if you still can't access it, then it's your problem, it's your fault. And again, I found that profit won over the common good. And this time it was even more hurtful because it was in the service of accessibility. There was an industry that grew up dependent on web accessibility problems. And I knew that we could solve web accessibility and we needed to move on to greater accessibility threats that were emerging. But there was this obsession with an industry that would certify and test and would get deeper and deeper into issues that to me seemed like they could be solved if we thought about the problem in a much greater way. And I got asked again, why do we want to reduce human difference? Why do we want to deny complexity and change the unexpected? And another question that was emerging, or a new thread that became more and more clear to me, was we were holding on to or trying to achieve perfection, completeness, and permanence in all of these activities. But I realized that if we achieve these, we will be extinct. We will produce a monoculture. A monoculture can be felled with a single blow. I have a family history aware of the importance of diversity to survive complexity. In my ancestor, I guess my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was the first person to coin the term botany and the term biology. And so I had been brought up to understand the importance of diversity and the importance of allowing diversity, not to winnow down or to compete for the winning thing that would allow us to thrive and for us to progress. And this is a theme that I don't have the time to get in here, but one that I have been arguing for quite some time. And certainly the social Darwinism is something that I've been fighting. And the lessons and the threads and the worries and the questions came up again when I became a formal part of the academy, not a tutor at McMaster, but when I joined U of T and I founded my center and I started to teach as an instructor, but also as a student, because I earned my next 2 degrees and I became an educator. And I was very distressed there at the push to produce standardized, conformant, competitive students. The request that I mark on a bell curve, that I rank all the students on the same scale, that we were talking about something like a terminal degree, like education was achieved and then it didn't need to be lifelong. And this just heightened my worries about where were we going? What are we doing? Who are we leaving out? What are we trying to produce? And I started to think about the wabi-sabi of learning. I proposed an alternative, the learning value of the imperfect, the impermanent, and the incomplete, and our need to think about and to continue to value the imperfect, the impermanent, and the incomplete. The imperfect invites participation in the exercise. The impermanent recognizes that there is uncertainty. There's many things that we don't expect that we're going to encounter in our life. And the incomplete also invites someone to participate in helping to complete. But all of these came galvanized in an experience that happened back in 2015 that brought all these threads sort of together and made manifest my thinking. And this happened about 7 years ago, when the dystopian and utopian stories of the future of AI abounded, before there was a field of AI ethics. And my experience with AI came in a far more mundane guise. Back in 2015, I was asked to assess a number of machine learning-based decision systems used to guide automated vehicles through intersections. And many of you probably heard this part of my story because I've told this one quite a bit. I was able to test them with a capture of a friend who, unlike assumed that she'd lost control and they would push her back onto the sidewalk she'd come from. All the machine learning models assumed she was moving forward and chose to proceed through the intersection and thereby run her over. And I was assured that the learning models were immature and simply needed more relevant data. When I retested the models trained on more data about wheelchairs and intersections, they chose to run my friend over with even greater confidence. And this prompted me to think back and look at my data, the data that I had collected over my career. Since the 80s, in my pursuit of digital inclusion and one-size-fits-one's designs, I gathered this large data set of what people needed or required in a design. The only way that I could plot this data was to use a multivariate scatter plot, a three-dimensional multivariate scatter plot. I show it here, or a representation of it in 2 dimensions. Again and again, the pattern that emerged is what I've called the human starburst. It is follows what is called the normal distribution and looks like a bursting star. 80% of the needs are clustered in the middle, taking up about 20% of the space. The remaining 20% of the needs occupy the periphery, taking up 80% of the space. The needs in the middle are close together, meaning they're very similar. The needs at the periphery are far apart, meaning they're very diverse. And this means that the data at the periphery is sparse and is not representational. And the data I have about one person cannot represent another person at the margins. And so this recurring question comes up again: what happens to the diverse outliers and the small minorities? How do they get left out? And what is the danger to our system and to our health when we do that? And I realized that AI optimization and many of the systems that I had been in means that these individuals are fighting pervading models, are fighting pervading systems. And in academia and in markets, what happens with much of our thought and much of our study and our scholarships is that all of the conclusions we reach, what we think is evidence and what we think is truth, is highly accurate for that group, the 80% in the middle. It's inaccurate as you deviate from the middle, and it's wrong when you reach the periphery. And I realized that this is much more than about automated vehicles. It's much more than about AI. AI systems are simply power tools. And we've used these power tools to automate a number of things. And what we're doing now is we're using them as power tools to automate our thinking and our deciding. And they merely do things we have done more quickly and efficiently. And after all, AI, the test of AI is the Turing test, the test that if AI passes it, it can trick us into thinking it is a human deciding and answering. So what we're doing with AI is simply accelerating, amplifying, and automating what we've done in the past. Both the benefits and the harms. It speeds us in the direction we're already going, amplifies what's popular and what's profitable, and automates the choices we have made. Given the human starburst and our priority of popularity and monetary value, the same pattern happens in design. Design works for the middle, is difficult to use as you move from the middle, and doesn't work if your needs are at the jagged edge of our human starburst. And so this pattern ripples throughout all of our systems in society. In terms of design, in terms of products that we create, in terms of the knowledge, the truth, the evidence that we produce, in terms of who we produce as students, what our education produces, in terms of work and what we require in workers, and who we hire and who we choose to be part of our education. And even democracy is enthralled in these patterns. And this does damage not just to those individuals that are outliers or small minorities. It does damage to our society as a whole, because what we get as a result of it is mass production, mass communication, mass marketing, the popularity push. It reduces the innovation that we need. It reduces the choices that we have to address the next crisis. And one of the things that I've encountered in working with people who are concerned with complexity and with AI is that we're stuck on a local optima. We are hill climbing, optimizing the problems and the patterns of the past, and thereby eroding the slope. And what we need to do, in fact, is to find a global optima out of that crisis. And what we need to do in order to do that is do the opposite of what we've been doing, the opposite of what we think is the right thing, to climb down from that local optima, to find the global optima. And I know that there is some problem with thinking that science is the answer. Not that science is the answer, but the form that science has taken at the moment, thinking that evidence is quantified measures and the metrics that we use within science. Because what will happen then is we'll have the type of pattern that I learned through my experiences with AI. And we also think that democracy is the answer. And I'm not saying that science and democracy is not the answer, but the reduced form of democracy that we've assumed, that democracy is only one person, one vote. Because what will happen then is that the trivial needs of the majority will trump the critical needs of the few. And even my foray into design, because I didn't actually call what I was doing design until I reached academia, and where I thought a good home for me would be the notion of design for good. And I knew that design was moving away from design as design for startups, the 80-20 principle with quick wins and easy gains, and the notion of the design entrepreneur, where what you were trying to gain was a competitive advantage, the pitch, the dragon's den of design, which of course would result in the pattern of that I knew about what would happen to the periphery. And we were moving into a design 2.0, where we were looking at design research for what would be called the best design, that there was some foray into persona, fair representation, empathy, design thinking, and the design for good. But there were problems with even that, because what I've come to realize is that this design 2.0 is not enough. Design thinking competitively results or arrives at a winning solution, meaning someone is left out. Ensuring representation of only justice-seeking groups still means that there are people falling through the cracks and stranded at the edges, and we get the same pattern. Equity of opportunity is not enough. Equity of opportunity based on merit leaves disparity and removes dignity from those who cannot rise. Charity and giving sets up an untenable power imbalance between the giver and the receiver. Welfare and aid create a race to the bottom and fragmentation between groups needing aid during times of scarcity. And for the occupational therapist still in me, I've also learned that an overemphasis on independence and empowerment can lead to loneliness and isolation. And one of the lessons that I hope we have all learned is that none of us are safe until all of us are safe. And this leads to us to consider who are all of us we should be most concerned about. I've learned that we need to think about that view from the edge, because that's where innovation and weak signals are. And those are what we need if we're going to find that global optima, because people closest to the bottom are most diverse. They're less invested in the past and more willing to think about alternatives and to climb down from that local optima. And that is who is the fittest. It's not the comfortable and the complacent. It's not those who have power, but those who have to think about resourcefulness on a daily basis, who know that life is uncertain. And if we design with those individuals, if those individuals help us to think about how we need to redesign our systems, then all of us will have room for change and growth. And I know that the only real certainty is that at any time when you least expected, with the greatest probability, we'll all be at that outer edge. And we need to upend the hierarchy of compromise. That thing that we say to people who need change: be happy with what you have. Disability, I know, constrains adaptability, and compromise costs ever greater. So it's those individuals at the outer edge that should not compromise. We also need to upend the hierarchy of justification. The excluded at the moment have the largest burden of justification for change. the included can rely on, that's just the way we do things. This is our standard procedure. And what I've developed together with my team is this notion of the 3 dimensions of inclusive design. This is sort of what has culminated from many of my lessons and the lessons of our team. That first of all, we have to recognize diversity, variability, and respect that people need self-knowledge and are the greatest experts in what they require and what will work for them. And we need to do that in an integrated way. The second thing is we need to have an inclusive process. We need to co-design with those individuals that feel the greatest difficulty or cannot use our current system. And we need to continuously ask, who are we missing? And when we talk about inclusion, it's not inclusion in a table that we've already constructed. We need to invite those individuals to help us to frame the problem and to create the table. And we need to be cognizant of benefit for all, the nested, complex adaptive system we all live in, or anything we propose is not going to survive. Our culture change is not going to survive. And our alternative to the design squiggle, where we competitively find the best design, or the many things that we do within academia, our notions of what is evidence, what is proof, are seeking statistical significance, is the virtuous tornado, which rather than a linear logic model, rather than finding the winning solution, the fix, the best, the proof, what we're doing is we're actually iterating to stretch out to include more and more requirements. So at each cycle, we create something that can be used, that can be tested. We grow from small successes, starting though at the outer edge, those individuals that can't use or have greatest difficulty with our designs. And at each iteration, we try to stretch to include more. And learning from the pandemic, I've learned why we need vulnerability and fragility to survive. It compels us to create a system that will work for us when we're vulnerable. It helps us to survive the next storm. Perfect monocultures, we know, won't survive. Social Darwinism, which there's been such a call for lately, will leave us without adaptive choices or safety nets. When our processes are guided by individuals who have lived experience of struggle and adversity, our systems will function in times of struggle and adversity. And I am so glad that you have the Co-Design Hub, and I would love to continue the conversation.
Wow. I'm going to give people a few minutes to digest a lot of really beautifully articulated ways of putting into words, I think, things that we have struggled with. So lovely. I'm going to invite questions, comments, responses. We have a bit of time for that, which is great. So you can put up your hand if you want to use the standard norm, or you could just jump in, or you could pop in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. I know, Emma, if you could pop in the chat also evaluation. One of the things we want to do with the speaker series is to get feedback from people. So again, pop your ideas in and we'll start a dialogue. Go ahead, Michelle.
Sure, I'll get the ball rolling. Thank you so much. That was a brilliant talk, and I just want to like hang on to all of your words. My questions for you, you articulated so beautifully vulnerability and sort of this detachment from certainty of outcomes from the work. And being situated still in academia, I wonder how you push back against the traditional systems, whether they're granting agencies or other structures in place that are pretty much demanding higher and higher levels of certainty.
Right, yeah. And that's such a good question. The center, the Inclusive Design Research Center that that is my, the center of my community, is dependent on funding. We're not actually supported by the university. We've been surviving through grants and contribution programs and things of that nature. So yeah, we're so embedded in academic funding and the peer review process and the being able to compete against proposals that are very much in line with sort of the dominant set of criteria. And of course, everything that all of the objections that I have with it are become so acute when I look at the calls for proposal, which ask for a linear logic model, which ask for a Gantt chart, a PERT chart, which or even research ethics, which of course says you have to actually say exactly what you're going to be asking people. You have only one way of telling people about what they're going to be involved in, which is so unfitting for co-design, in fact. And so we're looking at alternative co-design systems. Basically, I'm now at a point where I've decided that I've perfected that sort of knife edge between being sufficiently critical in my response to the funding agencies. I've tried to actually question the criteria at the same time that I explain why we should be funded. So I've decided I'm not going to compromise my values. So I've been using my funding applications to say, this is what you want. This is why I think that's misguided. And here is what I propose instead. And here is why it actually better meets the spirit of what you're asking for than what you've set out here. And it sometimes works, it sometimes doesn't, but that risk has paid again and again. I actually had to, my PhD thesis was actually a dissertation against PhD theses and the requirements and the experience of the PhD. I actually had two false starts in a doctorate. And my final doctorate was landing on that because the requirements regarding how I was supposed to jam my area of study, the people that I was interested into a system that really didn't fit and that really didn't do justice or respect or gave people dignity, was just so offensive to me that I did abandon to the PhD process twice. So yes, it's been quite a struggle. The interesting thing is that AI is something that all of a sudden I can make manifest the arguments that were seen to be this wishy-washy, fuzzy, unempirical assertions that I had been making. Because what happens in AI is we are actually mechanizing that. And so it's easy to demonstrate, well, look at, if you mechanize these things that you've been doing, if you amplify them to the extent that you can see the effects, then I can show what damage you've been doing here. I can show just what are the risks. So this field that actually is something that you would think would be very, very foreign to where I'm at, has actually been a boon to persuading that, you know, there are risks with where we're going right now. And I could speak more about that, but anyways, I think Chelsea has a question.
Somewhat, hi Jutta, it's so nice to see you.
Yeah.
Somewhat in response to what you just said, and also in response to my area of research, I am wondering if you could speak more to how we can plant the seeds of inclusivity in undergraduate design education as a discipline. And could inclusive design as a professional practice curriculum have a place in the academy?
Yeah, no, I definitely, I think it needs to permeate everything. It needs to sort of, and Chelsea, you have heard a lot of my rants already, but one of
I'm open to many more. I'd like to hear them all.
Yeah. And the reason Chelsea said, yeah, actually seeing me, this is the first time I've turned off on my camera again after I had brain surgery, and so it's lovely to actually be on camera again. I've grown enough hair, and I learned yesterday while I was in the studio how to comb across. So yeah, definitely. I think it needs to go even further back. I think it needs to start at kindergarten, the types of values, because one of the things that I figured out being in academia and post-secondary education is there was just so much unlearning that we needed to do, that when I started the program at OCAD, the first course was unlearning and questioning. I had to deconstruct all of the socialized conventions that people had, the sort of valorized values that, or the assumptions and presumptions that people made before we could even get into any of what we wanted to learn or practice the things that we wanted to practice. And I think it would be great if that didn't need to be the case. If we started out in grade 1 to think about diversity, to value differentiating, and students being the owners and the agents in their own learning, understanding that learning is lifelong, understanding that in fact what we need is not conformance or standardization and ranking of students on the same scale. We need a diversity of perspectives, and we need to nurture that diversity of perspectives. So yes, we do need this in undergraduate education, and it needs to be part of every field that is out there, which is what I started to try to do in U of T. It was many streams and many it was minors, it was sort of optional courses, but I learned that unless we did that unlearning, that it was going to be a precarious value, that if there was a cost issue or if there was a time issue, it was always going to fall off the table. So that's why I started a program, which really wasn't my original intent. I wanted to permeate everything with these practices and these thoughts.
As you know, I am very much behind that as a movement particularly within design education, in part because it's my perspective that as a practicing designer, that designers are responsible for a lot of the ills in the world. And so we have a corresponding responsibility and duty to hopefully create a whip effect where, you know, when we interrogate that within ourselves as a community, that we cause that movement to happen in a backward fashion, if
Yeah.
you know what I'm saying. And
Growing from
it-
small successes, the ripple effect. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
Thank you. And I see that Erin put a question in there. And I love the point that you're making. I mean, one of the things that I also feel that we do damage with is the insider language of academia, that sort of hallowed halls of the exclusivity of academia. And so my early forays into academic journals and things like that was to rebel and try to think about how do we make the things that we learn, or how do we express them in a way that there isn't this border, this boundary, this that we create. I mean, and also to try to use as little insider language as possible. So yes, there are early elementary book lists for children. Actually, if I turned on my camera, you would see that I think I have a children's library, or I have more children's books here than actually is in the library down the road.
Wow. I'm aware of the time and it's almost 1 o'clock, although I feel like I'd love to talk for another hour, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I just really, really want to thank you, Jutta, for provoking us a little bit, for the work that you're doing to champion change and how we think about design. You have given us lots of food for thought, I think, that we can take forward to kind of continue our own journeys, I think, around in our own work as kind of clinicians, as designers, as educators, as trainees, kind of going out into the world. And I think I love your story about the failures, kind of moving us on to success, and hearing a little bit of your personal journey as well is really incredibly powerful. And that starburst image I will definitely take forward into my own thinking and the work that I do. So just really, really want to thank you on behalf of all of us here for sharing your insights and wisdom with us.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. And I'm very serious. I would love to talk to anyone and continue the conversation.
Yes, we will figure out how to do that. I think this is part of what the speaker series is about, is finding like-minded people and continuing and advancing the ideas forward. So we'll definitely be following up. And so again, please, a reminder to people to fill out the evaluation. There's a place there for suggestions as well for us going forward. And again, thank you so much. And Emma's reminding me the recording is available on the Co-Design Hub website. Someone had also asked about slides, and I'll check with you as well about that.
Yeah, I'll give you, I'll send you the slides.
Awesome, that would be great.